Okay, great. So, like I said, this lecture is going to be about Confucianism. I will first start by going over the history of Confucianism and then give an interpretation of both Confucianism and Neo-Confucianism. I'll explain the difference as we go. But starting with the historical context, I believe it is important to go over the history of Confucianism so that we understand where Confucianism comes from and what are the questions that it was trying to answer. So let's start in ancient China with the rise of the Zhou dynasty, as you can see in 1045 BCE. Now, the Zhou dynasty was replacing the Shang dynasty, and the big question at the time was, how do you legitimize this new Zhou rule to the conquered Shang people? And so they came up with King Qing's proclamation, which says, as you can see, in days past, your late ancestor accepted the great command, and King Wu carried conquest of the great city of Shang, announcing it to Tian that our king has indeed De. Now you'll notice that I left two terms untranslated, Tian and De. Now I'll go over what those terms mean right now. Now here are the characters for those two terms. And if you don't have any background in the Chinese language, just know that the written language is essentially supposed to be like pictographs. The characters are supposed to look like the things that they represent. And so let's start with Tian. Now, normally when people translate Tian, they translate it as heaven. And I would agree that that is a good translation if you're talking about medieval China onward. But we're in ancient China right now. And in ancient China, the concept of Tian was a little different. And as you can see from this character here, Tian clearly looks like a person. Now, in medieval China, heaven is a correct translation for Tian because in medieval China, Tian was a more sort of abstract concept. But in ancient China, Tian was anthropomorphic. And so I would argue that Tian is better translated right now as something like big sky, because ancient Chinese people literally understood Tian as this giant figure sprawled over the sky. And now, at a very related term, we have De. And explaining this pictograph is a little more complicated, but as you can see, there's clearly an eye here. And people have had different interpretations of what these lines mean, but there are two main interpretations. The first is that these lines sort of signify a downward direction. So you have this eye looking down. The other interpretation is that you have this crossroads here, and the eye is looking upon you while you're at this crossroads. But either way, both interpretation boils down to essentially the same meaning. This eye is supposed to be the eye of big sky, and you're at this choice. The eye of big sky is either looking down upon you, or at this crossroads where you have to make a decision, and the eye of big sky is upon you. So essentially, big sky is watching you, and he was judging your decision. And depending on whether or not it's a good decision or a bad decision, that will determine whether or not you have De. So people have translated De as virtue, but it's a little more complicated than that because De is directly related to big sky himself. De is something that is directly received from big sky, at least right now in ancient Zhou China. And so if I had to sort of depict how this sort of structure works, it would look a little something like this. Specifically, De is reserved only for the king. In other words, commoners cannot have De. Only the king can have De because only the king is in contact with big sky. And so this is how the Zhou legitimized their rule to the Shang. They said the Shang rulers used to have De. They used to have the blessing of big sky, but they lost it. And now the Zhou rulers are the people with De now. And that way the Zhou rulers are now the new rulers. The commoners, as you can see, don't figure into this picture at all. Now we fast forward to the second half of the Zhou dynasty, also known as the Eastern Zhou or the Warring States period. And by this time, the original Zhou government has essentially completely collapsed, and it's total chaos. You have tons of mini-states that are all vying for control of China. And the big question at this time was, what is the proper method of governance? Because the idea is, if you have a good method of governance, then you can attain power, and that helps you unite China. And so in response, you have a huge variety of philosophical schools all rising up to answer this question of proper governance. And people have called this time period the period of 100 philosophical schools, which might be a bit of an exaggeration, but it shows you, gives you an idea of the immense variety of philosophical thought that was going on at the time. And one of those philosophical schools was Confucianism. Confucius was a traveling advisor during the Warring States period, and he went around to different states also trying to answer the question, what is the proper method of governance? And the answer that Confucius came to was that he focused on personal morality above everything else. And to do that, he quite literally changed the way De was written. Take a look at this. So here's the old de, as we had shown before. But this is how Confucius changed the way de was written. He added this little part here at the bottom. And this is the sort of ancient way of writing the heart symbol. Other than that, the things mostly remain the same. But the idea is here, the heart is sort of indicative of the self, right? And so you introduce this idea of like personhood, of self, of like the self into de. And that makes de more possible for morality. This makes de a sort of signal of virtue and personal like ethics. And because of that, the key innovation here is that now commoners have access to de. Now, whereas the king, because only like king could have de because it was something directly received from big sky. But now de is a symbol of personal virtue, and now commoners can have de as well. And Confucius called those commoners who cultivated de junzi, which have been sometimes translated as gentleman, sometimes translated as sage, but essentially a junzi is sort of a wise commoner who knows de, who knows virtue, who knows morality, and because of that, they can serve as potential advisors to the king, they can serve in government, and they can just do all of that. Commoners are now sort of included in this sphere. And this is the big innovation of Confucius. He makes morality possible by changing the way de was written, by changing the meaning of de to include personal virtue. So that is the historical context of Confucianism. Next, I will go into like what this virtue actually means. But before I do that, I'd like to quickly ask if anyone has any questions so far.
I have a question. Okay, wait, this is a bad question, but I edit the videos later. But the the heart, it's very like it's very like phallic, I guess. So do you have any theories about that?
Yeah, I'll be honest, that's the first thing I thought too when I saw it. But no, it is a heart symbol. I mean, you can think of it as like sort of this is like the sort of main vessel, and then these like the sort of like, you know, like branches. I don't know, like I don't know biology, but it's like fucking coming out of the heart, you know? But no, like it is a heart symbol. I mean, I don't have it prepared, but like I can show you like the sort of modern way de was written. If I can like look it up on Google, but you'll see in the modern way de was written, it literally is the heart symbol right here. Any other questions? Okay, great. Well, let's move on then. So let's get on to what the ethics of Confucianism actually means. So here is where I get into my personal interpretation of Confucianism, right? What I've shown you before is like a sort of, well, essentially what I showed you before was what my professor taught me in his own lecture of sort of the history of Confucianism. But like that was like a sort of more generally accepted scholarly interpretation. This comes from my own scholarship, right? And I will defend it right here. So I would argue that Confucianism is a role ethics. What this means is essentially that ethics comes from properly serving your social roles. Now, role ethics starts by defining the self as composed of a network of social relationships. They say there is no I without I being this parent, this teacher, this citizen, etc. And with every social role comes with it a certain set of social responsibilities. For example, if you are a teacher, then you have a responsibility to like know the material that you're about to present, to be able to explain it well, and like to be able to answer questions. If you're a student, that also means that you have this responsibility to like listen properly to this lecture and like, you know, be able to sort of put in that effort to actually comprehend this material. So all of these relationships are sort of reciprocal in this sense, in that everyone has these duties like related to each other. And this is how role ethics defines the self. There is no concept of a sort of individual self because you can never exist as a true individual. You're always sort of, oh yeah, thank you for the modern way. But yeah, so there is no truly individual self because you're always in this network of social relationships. And you can see this sort of idea of this importance of social roles in Confucianism with this idea of the rectification of names. And this is a quote from the Analects: "Let the ruler be a ruler, the subject a subject, the father a father, the son a son." Now, this sort of relates to the 5 cardinal relationships that Confucius himself sort of defined, which is ruler, minister, father, son, elder brother, younger brother, husband, wife, and friends. But that's sort of like besides the point. That just sort of goes to show that he was really sort of concerned about these social relationships. And he says that in order for society to function properly, people need to live up to their names. People need to live up to their social roles. If the ruler is not acting like a ruler, then society fundamentally cannot function. And so this is essentially what he means by the rectification of names. It is essentially a role ethics. So how do you rectify these names? How do you make sure that all of these people are properly serving their roles? Well, Confucius's answer was ritual. And his idea here was that ritual serves heaven above and earth below. It honors forefathers and ancestors. It exalts lords and teachers. These are the three roots of ritual. So as you can see from this quote, clearly ritual is connected to social roles in some way. It serves the lords and the teachers. It serves the forefathers and the ancestors. Essentially, ritual means that you perform duties according to like a certain like sort of set of rules, and that ensures that you will be properly fulfilling your roles, right? If you like these rituals were designed in the first place so that you will be properly carrying out your roles. And so Confucianism puts this sort of immense emphasis on the importance of ritual. And the other big aspect of Confucianism is archaism. Now, this is like a sort of defining aspect of Confucianism, but people really look to the past with Confucianism. They look to this sort of golden age of like the Shashang and the Zhou, that is the original Zhou, before everything fell apart. And they say like, oh, this is like the golden age when everyone had their names rectified, when everyone was properly serving their social roles. And they say we need to be able to copy that in the present. And so essentially the past serves as an impetus for morality today. And so you see this here in the Analects, I was not born with knowledge, but being fond of antiquity, I am quick to seek it. So he says, so clearly the past here works as this sort of motivation. Because he likes the past, because he is fond of the past, he wants to seek knowledge, he wants to seek morality. And so various scholars have tried to explain this. And the most sort of convincing interpretation I've come across is this idea of a focus field metaphor. And this comes from Roger Ames. He writes, we are from the outset nested in and informed by the field of familial and communal relations within which we evolve. And so this is a sort of field that you're placed in, right? Ames writes about this in relation to role ethics. You have this sort of field of relations, and you have a focus within that field of a certain individual who is nested within this field of relations. And I argue that you can apply the same thing with sort of Confucian archaism. You have this field of time itself where you have all these previous dynasties in the past and all of that. And then you have the focus of the present, in which the present also, like the past is implicated, and you need to follow the examples of the past even in the present itself. And so you see this in the Analects where he says, the Zhous are splendid in culture, having before it the example of the two previous dynasties. So here he clearly praises Zhou because in the context of the past, right? Zhou is not this sort of dynasty that stands by itself. Whenever you talk about the Zhou, you are always implicating these two previous dynasties before it. And so this is the idea of the focus field metaphor. You have this greater field, but within it you have a certain focus, and this focus always implicates the rest of the field. And this is how archaism works, and this is also how role ethics works. Right? You have a certain individual, and this individual is within this greater field of relationships. And when you talk about a certain individual, you also imply all of its relationships that this person is in. And so there have been two main other interpretations of Confucianism, and I would argue against them in this lecture. So the other big interpretation of Confucianism is Confucianism as a virtue ethics. This is probably the other most popular one, like sort of competing with role ethics. And this sort of comes from this sort of constant use of the word virtue in Confucianism. I mean, if you read the Confucian classics, they do constantly use the word virtue. So people think, oh, must be a virtue ethics, just the same way, you know, these ancient Greeks had these virtue ethics. But the ancient Greek virtue ethics is very different from Confucian ethics, because in the ancient Greek ethics, virtue was essentially just this thing that an individual had. An individual was essentially this canister that sort of cultivated virtue, and then once they had virtue, they became moral. But Confucianism does not share this understanding of the self in the first place, because like I said before, for Confucianism, the self is always implicated in social relationships. And so similarly, virtue also needs to be implicated within social relationships. As you can see here in the Analects, here it says, once the roots are established, the way will grow therefrom. Being good as a son and obedient as a young man is perhaps the root of a man's character. So clearly he says that in order to find the way, you need to properly serve your role as a son or a man or like whatever. And so virtue here then only comes from serving social roles. Virtue isn't something that an individual cultivates by himself. And similarly, you see here in the Mencius, who was a follower of Confucianism, Mencius is a follower of Confucius, virtue is clearly subordinate to relationships. He writes, if everyone around the king is, this famous person, then who will help the king do evil? But if no one around the king is this famous virtuous person, then who will help the king do good? So clearly, the king by himself isn't sufficient. Like the king's virtue by himself is not sufficient. He needs to have these good relationships around him. He needs to surround himself with good people. And if he has these good social relationships, then the king himself will also do good. So fundamentally, virtue is more subordinate to relationships under Confucianism. Now, the other big interpretation of Confucianism is Confucianism as a rule ethics. If you have any previous background in philosophy, this would typically be called deontology. But essentially, the idea of rule ethics is that you have these like inflexible rules that are like just that is how you judge morality. For example, it is always wrong to kill, or like it is always wrong to steal, or something like that. But Confucianism is not like that, because Confucianism actually advocates for flexibility. As you can see here, it says, show yourself when the way prevails in the empire, but hide yourself when it does not. So there is no like single rule here, but rather you should adapt yourself according to the circumstances around you. And he also talks about how like you need to sort of adapt your own way of finding virtue, of being able to cultivate relationships if you have, like, according to your own unique potential. For example, Confucius is talking about two of his followers here in this quote. He says, Zhang Yu holds himself back. It is for this reason that I tried to urge him on. Sulu has the energy of two men. It is for this reason that I tried to hold him back. And so clearly he's talking about how, oh, these two people are clearly different people. I mean, not only are they different people, they're also under different social relationships. And so for this reason, the way they attain morality is fundamentally different for the two of them. And so this sort of flexibility would go against reading Confucianism as a rule ethics. So that is the sort of basic explanation of Confucianism. Next, I will go on to the sort of interpretation of Neo-Confucianism, which is like a revival of Confucianism in medieval times. But before I do that, does anyone have any questions? Make sense to everyone? Or is everyone just so like flabbergasted they don't even know where to begin asking questions? Well, I'll have more time for questions at the end. So if no one has any questions now, we'll come back later. So let's go on to Neo-Confucianism. So like I said, Neo-Confucianism was this sort of revival of Confucianism in medieval times. And essentially what happened here was that Neo-Confucianism started to respond to some of these metaphysical concerns that were brought up by like Buddhism and Taoism, because the original Confucianism was fundamentally like an ethics and like a political philosophy, right? Remember how I talked about in the historical context, the fundamental question that Confucius was dealing with was, how do you govern properly? Right? He was not concerned with like, what is the meaning of existence or what is the nature of humans or anything like that, right? But when you get Buddhism and Taoism later, they start asking those questions, and Confucianism just did not have any way of responding to those questions. And so Neo-Confucianism then was this sort of revival of Confucianism in order to respond to these more metaphysical questions. And in order to do this, they essentially adopted certain aspects of Buddhism and Taoism, and this changed also the way Neo-Confucianists understood ethics. And specifically, I argue that this Neo-Confucian ethical turn was the sort of incorporation of virtue ethics. And specifically, Neo-Confucian ethics begins with this virtue ethics like cultivation, but it still ends with this classical Confucianism role ethics. So Reflection on Things at Hand was written by Zhu Xi, who is like widely considered the sort of founder of Neo-Confucianism. And he wrote here, it is not that today there are no people who practice filial piety or brotherly respect. The reason why they have failed to develop their nature fully is that they practice filial piety and brotherly respect without understanding them. So he clearly still talks about how, like, these sort of relationships and filial piety and brotherly respect is important, but you need to be able to understand them first. And this sort of understanding process is fundamentally an individual process, right? You sort of need to just learn by yourself. You need to cultivate yourself as an individual, and then you'll be able to sort of properly practice ethics. So This is like a completely different understanding of individual from classic Confucianism, where in classic Confucianism, the individual is like impossible, right? Because the individual was always in this field of social relationships. But now in Neo-Confucianism, it is possible to have an individual, and it is possible to have this individual cultivate themselves. But once you have cultivated yourselves, you end up coming back to this classical role ethics, where ethics ultimately is still carried out by properly fulfilling social roles. And so you see here, merely to talk about manifesting the clear character and not to talk about loving the people would be to behave like the Taoists and the Buddhists. So Neo-Confucianism is still sort of trying to criticize Taoism and Buddhism, try to sort of establish their own school. And so they say like the main problem with Taoism and Buddhism is that they don't talk about loving the people. In other words, they don't care about fulfilling social relationships. All they talk about is just manifesting your own individual clear character, but that doesn't actually mean anything to the Neo-Confucians. For Neo-Confucians, actual ethics comes from like properly fulfilling social roles. And so how did they sort of reach this conclusion? This comes from, like I mentioned before, this sort of new Neo-Confucian metaphysics like that they added. And Neo-Confucian metaphysics is fundamentally dualistic. You have this idea of principle, or li, and then you also have material force, which I didn't write here, but it's like qi. And it's like, essentially all you need to understand is that principle is a sort of guiding order of like the entire universe, whereas material force is just like the actual like physical matter in which principle like inherits. Like for example, like there is this sort of, you have this like physical like tree or whatever, but there's still like a principle guiding behind it that's sort of guiding like, oh, what is a tree supposed to be like, right? So principle is sort of more abstract in this sense. And Neo-Confucian principle is unique because in Neo-Confucianism, there is a sort of universal principle, like a single universal principle, which sort of governs the like everything in the universe. Like everything follows a single order that is defined by principle. And at the same time, everyone has their own sort of unique way of like expressing this principle. And that essentially is a way of connecting an individual to the larger universe around them, right? Everyone contains within themselves principle. And so everyone contains sort of part of this universal principle. And that is why, once again, we locate the individual within this larger field of the universe around them, because everyone sort of shares this common principle. And now Neo-Confucian ethics is all about attaining understanding of this principle. And so Zhu Xi writes, the sage regards everything in the world as his own self. The sage, the sort of person who has reached virtue, the person who has understood principle, has realized that his own principle that is contained within himself is also shared by the world around him. And so he realizes then that he's no longer just an individual by himself. He realizes that he is also connected to just the universe around him. And that is why he realizes that we need to follow role ethics. That is why he realizes, oh, I need to properly serve my social roles so I can properly interact with the universe around me, because everything in the universe is sharing the same principle that I am. And so this is where the virtue ethics thing sort of comes in this sort of initial cultivation where you're trying to reach this understanding of principle. And then once you do reach this understanding of principle, then you come to the role ethics conclusion. I would like to compare this sort of with this theory of altruism that people come up with in psychology. And it's sort of oneness theory of altruism. So there have been, multiple sort of theories of altruism. Some have even said altruism doesn't exist, but a really compelling one is that altruism, which is sort of this act of like, caring for others, or just like being good to others without sort of concern for your own like self-benefit. This is sort of, the theory is that it comes from identifying yourself with this other person. So the example that like people give is this sort of idea of like a sports team. So for example, like let's say you're like on a sports team, whatever, and like one of your teammates gets like knocked down by like the opponent, like clearly like a foul play move, right? Like instantly, like everyone on your team is sort of like, oh, like that was like a dirty move, right? Like you shouldn't have done that. And that's like, but the reason people do that is because they identify that person as part of their team, right? Like you're just this one team, this one unit. And so to harm this like one person in this team is to harm this whole unit. And so you sort of identify everyone together in this sort of single unit. And that is why you sort of look out for everyone within there. That is essentially how principle works here. You identify yourself with the entire world because everyone shares this idea, the same principle. And so you sort of look out for everyone in this world by properly observing your social roles so that you can properly serve like all the people that you come into contact with and just the universe at large. So now the only thing that's left to explain is that there are like, schools within Neo-Confucianism, and the sort of difference between these two main schools is that how this initial sort of virtue ethics self-cultivation process works. So Zhu Xi, who I mentioned before, is like this widely regarded as like the founder of Neo-Confucianism. His big thing was knowledge first, action later. And so this was like essentially he talked about how you need to like study from like books and things like that. And then like once you like learn from these books, then you can like put like what you've learned into action. And his big thing was about seriousness, because he said that, oh, you need to approach everything with this proper mindset. You need to approach everything with seriousness, because that is the only way that you can like properly learn things. Now, Wang Yangming, who comes a bit later, he sort of challenges Zhu Xi, and he advocates for this idea of unity of knowledge and action. And so Wang Yangming essentially adopts a lot of elements from like Zen Buddhism. In Chinese, it's called Chan Buddhism. But the idea here is that you learn by doing. Like the sort of textbooks are not so like important as like actually being able to just sort of like put things in action. And like that's what Zen Buddhism was all about, right? Like you sort of reached enlightenment, you meditated by like actually doing things. And that's what Wang Yangming was like too. So Wang Yangming said, oh, you just need to do things and that's how you learn. So like that's just like sort of details about how different schools within Neo-Confucianism differ, but fundamentally they're all about this. You need to sort of cultivate your character, and then once you reach this understanding, then you go back to world ethics. So that's the end of my lecture. Any questions?
Can you like repeat the part where you like explain, I guess like do you have like a way to explain like the fundamental difference between like I guess like Western like virtue ethics or like epistemology, and then like I guess like Confucian ones, and then also like do you think that since it seems like both fields would be interacting, do you think that like the mainstream like virtue like ethics like researchers or like people have been more influenced by like Confucian like studies like recently? I don't know.
Wait, I don't understand the second question.
Okay, like I was just thinking like because it like I don't really like you don't really encounter like I guess like Confucian like ideas, I guess, or like with like I feel like with mainstream like virtue ethics it's mostly like Western like authors. So like I don't really know like how like influenced would they be by like Confucianism, I guess, because it seems like honestly I have a really hard time like distinguishing like it just seems like be like oriented toward like being like good, which I know is like yeah.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So sure, I can talk a little bit about that. Just as like a sort of before, like a sort of disclaimer before I start, I don't have that much background in virtue ethics either. My background is in Confucianism, which, as I argue, is not a virtue ethics. But the sort of main difference, as far as I can tell, is that like sort of the Western virtue ethics is still all about the individual. And it's like if the individual can have virtue and like this, what this virtue means like differs depending on the school of virtue ethics that you're talking about, right? But like the idea is if this individual has virtue, then they are sort of like automatically moral. Like if they have virtue, then there's like everything they do, it should be considered moral. And like they sort of are able to get away with that because they're saying, oh, like the virtuous person wouldn't do like immoral things. Like that's why they're virtuous. But like the idea then is that like in order to be moral, you need to sort of be able to cultivate this virtue within yourself so that you can just sort of like do these like moral things, but like have this virtue or whatever. And then as for like your second question about like Western like virtue ethics authors and like Confucianism, like I would say like that is like a sort of big point against interpreting Confucianism as a virtue ethics. Like most of the authors who would like try to interpret Confucianism as a virtue ethics, in my opinion, are like very much like Eurocentric in their thought. They're like, oh, like Plato thought about it like this. He was like an ancient philosopher. Confucius was also an ancient philosopher. You know, they're talking about virtue. But like, I just like don't think that like if you actually like look like virtue ethics as a framework was originally developed based on ancient Greek philosophers. And so like if you try to apply that, like sort of force that onto like an entirely different like philosophy and bred in like an entirely different culture, like I just think it's not going to work very well. And so like role ethics, I would say is like a much better interpretation. Okay, so Ellen asks, what are some ways Confucianism can be used in a debate? Yeah, so that's a good question. I would say that this is best used as like a framework, obviously. Like, I assume that people have at least had been introduced to all the different like debate events, right? And so that you know that Lincoln Douglas then is like a very much like a sort of morality-based event that like uses framework and things like that. And obviously Confucianism can be used as a framework for Lincoln Douglas. And you can sort of obviously, you know, you can like, I don't know like what the like resolution would be, but like you can argue that like, you know, preserving social roles is how you achieve morality. And you argue that your side is like the best way to preserve social roles or something like that. Like preserving social roles, remember, can be like very broadly defined. Like Confucianism, like Confucius himself focuses a lot on the family because that's just like, I don't know who he was. But like another big thing about Confucius is that like it has like a political dimension to it, right? Remember, like one of your social roles is like a citizen of the state, or like another like one of your social roles can be like a sort of governor of like a sort of country or something like that, right? And so there are like duties associated with each of those roles. Like if you're not a good governor, then like you can be overthrown. Confucius literally said this. He said like if the king is like bad, then like it is absolutely the advisor's duty to overthrow that king. Um, and so like you can like use Confucianism in a sort of like political sense like that way as well, right? Like that is not like sort of stretching Confucianism. That was like absolutely part of Confucianism. Um, and then this is also something that I like theory crafted the other day with like Jesse if you went to his lecture. But like this is specifically for like circuit debaters. Does anyone here like do like circuit debate? Okay, cool. So for like the circuit debaters, I was thinking that you might be able to use Confucianism as like an anti-circuit debate framework if you want to run a lay case within a circuit debate like context, because mommy judges are a thing, right? And so like a Confucianism put like a lot of emphasis on like filial piety, you know, like serving your parents well or whatever. And so if mommy judges are a thing, like they're just like your regular parents who like don't know like this sort of technical jargon of debate, they're just sort of there, like, but like their parents, like they're just normal people. You gotta, you know, serve them well. And so like the argument there is that like this sort of regular circuit debate is fundamentally inaccessible to these lay people, to these mommy judges. And so like, whereas lay debate is more accessible to them. And that was just like something that I theory crafted the other night. Any other questions? Okay, I mean, if that's that, then that'll be the end. Thank you for coming to the lecture, and I hope y'all have a wonderful remaining amount of time at your camp. I will end the recording now.